Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I give you Marco Panza.
Thank you very much. So this is the third MPP year, and in the first year, I gave the inaugural lecture of the MPP seminar, and I wanted also to give it this year, but then for reason of date, we could not have invited the last speaker in this week, so we decided to modify the order. So I am the second to present. The first year I present a talk on Greek mathematics, a work that we made together, by the way, with Andrew and Jose and other colleagues. The second year I presented something on Frege, that is 19th century philosophy and mathematics, and this year I will come back to Greek philosophy, even not Greek mathematics, Greek philosophy. I hope next year, if I will be still alive, to give a talk to more modern topics concerned with 19th and 20th century mathematics and philosophy. Okay, so let's go. Zeno, Aristotle and Achilles, infinity and continuity. Let's see whether it works. It does not work, so let's go anyway. No, no. Okay, okay. Oh my God, but there is this that, sorry, you do not see what I see. Now, okay. Because there is it shows this in the middle. Okay. Okay, let's see whether it works now. In physics, Aristotle states Zeno's dichotomy and Achilles' paradoxes 4 times. 3 times the dichotomy and 1 time the Achilles. And he replies twice to both of them at once. The first statement, sorry, there is no way to eliminate these things.
Yes.
Okay, good. The first 2 statements, respectively, of the dichotomy and the Achilles, occur in 6-9 after a long development on motion and time. Here, what Aristotle writes in my translations, and with the help of Giovanna and Chiara, the first of Zeno logoi is about not moving, because what is displaced must arrive at the half before arriving at the end. The second is the so-called Achilles. It is this, that the slower runner will never be reached by the faster, for it is necessary that the pursuer arrive before where the pursued has moved from, so the slower will necessarily always remain somewhat ahead. By the way, the translations are the integral part of our interpretation of Aristotle, because translating Aristotle is not just a question of making a mechanical operation. Aristotle is not Plato. Aristotle writes notes of classes, and so you need to interpret in a strong way what you translate. The third and the fourth statement, both on the dichotomy, occur in 8:8 in the thick of a discussion about the continuity or non-continuity of displacement for A. Here, what they say summarizes Zeno's logos by claiming that it is always necessary to go through the half, and these halves are infinitely many, then it is impossible to go through these infinite halves. And summarized differently the same logos by admitting that while moving, the first half is to be counted, and each half that then comes, so that the whole having been traversed, an infinite number of halves have been counted, which is admittedly impossible. In translating the previous passages, I have tried to stay as close as possible to Aristotle's original text. I did not only it for the sake of frightfulness, but also and overall to make it clear that Aristotle is here not properly stating Zeno's argument, but rather evoking them for an audience already familiar to them, or to some versions of them. It is then hard to, base on this testimony, to reconstruct the original or standard form of this argument, provided there was something as an original, a standard form of them. It's not clear whether they were never written or they were simply transmitted orally in a tradition. In his splendid PhD dissertation, PhD student, splendid PhD dissertation, Rutgers 208, Benjamin Hallen has argued that Zeno's paradox were oral two-party question and answer dialectical arguments, which suggest that their form was only very broadly codified in general. Whether it is so or not, it is enough to compare Aristotle's previous mentions to see that he was not at all worried with rigorously fixing the theoretical building block. In the third of the foregoing argument, Aristotle seemed, for instance, to make the dichotomy concern apeira, and one may speculate whether the term is here used as a numerical adjective for two unwritten occurrences of alves, as in my translation, and as also suggested by the fourth rephrasing, or as a plural substantive to indicate some distances, each of which is somehow apeiros as such. In the first and second rephrasing, it seems instead to make both the dichotomy and Achilles concern the fact of arriving somewhere before somewhere else. And one may speculate whether this is a temporal before or a spatial one, as suggested by Giovanna Giardina in a recent book on Aristotle's discussion of the continuum in pre-Socratic philosophy. All seems then to indicate that Aristotle is taking this as immaterial details, by rather focusing on the common conceptual structure of his different rephrasings. This is also corroborated by Aristotle's claim that the Achilles is the same logos as the dichotomy. The only difference being, I quote, that the dividing is not in two. But what is this conceptual structure, according to Aristotle? An answer seems to come from Aristotle's first reply, which comes, by the way, already in 6.2, 7 chapters before the first rephrasing. So Aristotle replied the paradox 7 chapters before having presented them, which make it clear that he's speaking to an audience that was perfectly aware of what he was speaking about. Provided, of course, that the text that we have mirrored the original version of Aristotle's replies, we cannot know, of course. We cannot know for sure. By so confirming that he was taking Zeno's argument to be familiar to his audience. Here the answer, reply, Zeno's logos make the false assumption that it is not possible to go through the infinities or come up to the infinities one by one in a finite time. For both the length and the time, and in general every continuum, are doubly said to be infinite, either according to the division, categorisis, or at the extreme. Now it is not possible to come up to the infinities according to quantity in a finite time, but for those according to the division, this is possible, for also the time itself is infinite in this way. This sentence, also the time itself is infinite in this way, and overall the 4 in the beginning that indicated that according to Aristotle the reason for which the paradox failed is the hardcore of my presentation. The crucial claim here is the last one, Also, the time itself is infinite in this way, namely infinite cut diathesis by division. Let us try to better see which seems to be the point here. Zeno's set is that of an indeterminate track to be allegedly covered by an indeterminate character. As the identity of the character is irrelevant, as well as his or her alleged speed, we can assign this role to Achilles. So to make the dichotomy closer to the Achilles, I also need scenic design. This is my own invention. In literature, never Achilles appears in the first paradox, but this does not change things very evident. No doubt is raised about the presence in the scene both of the track to be covered and of Achilles himself. Also, the task he should accomplish is unquestioned. The point is whether he can accomplish it. To argue he cannot, Zeno divided the track in half, then the second half, or possibly also the first, this is not clear, in half again, whether he divided one or the both, or only the first, only the second, we discussed it yesterday in the formal meeting. The second half of this second half, or possibly also the first one, or the first one, and so forth, is apparent. Then he concludes that Achilles cannot cover the track, since before covering it, he has to cover each half, which is possible, all which is not possible, since the division is protracted as apparent. Or possibly that Achilles cannot even start from the same reason, which would seem a much more plausible conclusion. Aristotle's response is as simple as effective. He merely remarked that Zeno's conclusion does not follow, since not only the track, but also the time in which it is covered can be divided as apparent. In other terms, just as the division of the time does not forbid it to flow, that of the track does not forbid it to be covered. The argument is plain and sound. It prospects no sort of super task to be described with sophisticated mathematical or logical means, and or to be achieved thanks to some extraordinary physical or intellectual resources. To reference to super task is because there is a long literature of the fact that the Zeno paradox is the first example of super task. Here the argument is that there is no super task at all. Not only, as already correctly observed by Barbara Sattler, by Barbara Sattler, there is no super task here. There is no more any paradox, just an argumentative error. This point seems to me so simply clear and hands-on to make it hard for me to understand how Zeno's argument has been so much discussed and considered for centuries. The only counter-objections may be the following, it seems to me. The time does not flow, as it is analogous division is also there to show. The covering of the track has nothing to do with the time. In other more theoretical terms, motion and time are independent to each other, and thinking at the former, there is no way involved considering the latter. These are two possible objections to the idea that the simple observation that time and space divide in the same way are a solution of the paradoxes. But even if Zeno might have been ready to counter-respond in one or both of these ways, it does not seem that the possibility of these extreme moves may justify all the interest given to the paradox for centuries. Even if this Money's perspective had to be somehow admitted. One might, of course, imagine that from this perspective, time should be considered as a whole, undivided one, but then it would have been enough to anyone to observe, like Aristotle himself, that each motion is in time, which does not seem to be a so extraordinary theoretical invention. To retort again that the very division of the track to be covered that Zeno prospect immediately suggests that the whole of the time admit divisions. One might observe that is my lack of historical and philosophical sensibility, my anachronistic pretension of judging the past with the eyes of the present, abstract logic, or even of what appears natural to the present common sense, that makes me unable to see the deeper problem raised by Zeno. It's so deep one that even Aristotle's extraordinary insight was in the end not able to dismiss. This is possible indeed. But let me prospect the possibility that is rather a sort of historical deference to the past that makes many continue to think that there is a real theoretical problem hidden within Zeno's dichotomy. This does not make the question irrelevant to my eyes, however, since maintaining that Aristotle's reply unveil the straightforward error involved in Zeno's argument is the same thing as saying neither that his reply is logically trivial and ask for no further consideration, nor that it leaves no substantial question open for a reflection about motion, time, infinity, and continuity. Yes.
So, according to Aristotle, was Zeno's argument just wrong, or was there a gap in the argument?
Aristotle never writes in a so explicit way. In my reading of Aristotle, yes, what Aristotle says is the argument is a fallacious.
Because my reading of what you presented was there is a gap.
Oh, sorry?
There is a gap
in
the argument, which is different from saying it's wrong, right? Because if there's only a gap, then there is still something interesting.
No, I don't think that Aristotle tells it. So let's come back here. Aristotle does not say there is a big. Aristotle say read the response here, but then we will come back on the response. So let's see it. Zeno's logos make the false assumption, that it is not possible to go through the infinite or to come up to the infinite. No, it is a false assumption that it is not possible to go through the infinite to come to the infinite by one and definite time. In all these cases, there is an infinite division, a finite time is not possible to put them together. For both the length and the time, and in general every continuous, as doubly said to be infinite, either according to the division or at the extreme. Now, it is not possible to come up to the infinity according to quantity. So if we divide it the second way, of course, Zeno would be right. It would not possible to cover infinite and infinite time. But for those according to the division, this is possible. So Zeno was wrong in supposing that we cannot cover infinite in finite time, because we can do it for infinite according to division, and because also the time itself is infinite in this way. So according to me, this is clearly an argument that says that the argument is fallacious, because the argument supposes something that is not true, that is that we cannot cover infinities in finite time, but in fact we can do it only under one sense of infinity, but not under the other sense, and the other sense is what is relevant here. This seems to me the argument of Aristotle, but I will analyze the argument in detail in a moment. But this is the way in which I read the argument. Let me come back where we are. Okay, so since maintaining the Aristotle reply unveils the strike for the error involved in Zeno's argument is the same thing as saying neither that his reply is logically trivial, so I will come, nor that it leaves no substantial question open for a reflection about motion, time, infinite, and continuity. Let us begin with the former question. The logic of Aristotle's reply. This appears much more clearly when one passes from the dichotomy to the Achilles. Achilles does not only claim, as Aristotle does not only claim, as observed above, that the latter is the same as the former, that is the two paradoxes, substantially speaking. He maintains as well that it is necessary that also the solution be the same. It is necessary that also the solution be the same. Yes, but the setting of the two arguments is essentially different. In the Achilles, the track to be covered is not only indeterminated, as in the dichotomy, it is also put in question as such, so that the very presence of a certain finite track to be covered is purely alleged. At the opposite, something that was questioned in the dichotomy is plainly admitted in the Achilles. Both Achilles and the pursued character The tortoise will say later Themistius. The tortoise does not appear in Aristotle. It appears much later in Themistius. Both Achilles and the posture character, that is the tortoise, are openly admitted to move. More than that, the motion of the tortoise is even essential for the argument to develop, since it is just this motion that makes the division as apeiron occur. If the tortoise rested, the division would stop. To say it at once, the setting of the Achilles invert what is granted in the dichotomy with what is there questioned. It appears to motion to deny not that motion happens, but rather that it stops. How can then the solution be the same? The answer depends on this fact. Even if it is not immediately evident in the simple setting of the dichotomy, Aristotle's reply requires an act of analysis. He presupposes the track is covered in a given time and suggests to divide both the former and the latter in corresponding successive halves. What his final remarks shows is, properly speaking, not that Achilles actually moves, but that there is nothing contradictory or flawed in supposing that he does. To say it in another way, Aristotle analytically takes the task to be achieved and analyzes it backwards by observing that the simple admission of a double division of the distance covered at the time and the time taken to do it make the appearance of contradiction disappear. Aristotle is explicit about that. Here what he writes after his second and third mention of the dichotomy. In the earlier logoi, we have solved those of Zeno's logoi about motion by observing that time carries infinities within itself, For nothing is absurd when someone passes to infinite part in a finite time, since the infinite is there both in length and in time. For nothing is absurd. So the move of Aristotle is supposing the task realized and to say there is nothing contradictory in the fact that it can be realized. So there is no super task for Aristotle, absolutely nothing like that. What makes this same solution applies also to the Achilles is that the same analytic move can also be made in this case. Take Achilles to have reached the tortoise and analyze their motion in the same way by dividing both the distance covered and the time taken to do it in the way Zeno's setting suggests. Anew, no contradiction arises. Hence, there is nothing contradictory or flawed in admitting that this happens as the empirical evidence displays. Still, showing by analysis that there is nothing contradictory or flawed in supposing that Achilles achieved his task is the same neither as accounting for the process of division as apeiron involved in Zeno's logos, nor as explaining the achievement of this task and appropriately describing its structure. The former requires an appropriate account of apeiros and apeira, the latter an appropriate account of continuity. Aristotle's reply to the dichotomy in 6.2 is perfectly enough to dissolve any appearance of the paradox, but it leaves the problem open to appropriately describe Achilles' run in both arguments, by accounting at once for its unity at a single undivided event and its endless divisibility, namely for its continuity and its intrinsic infinity. So my point to be clear is the following. If we accept that the task can be realized, and we show Aristotle does, according to my reading, that there is nothing contradictory in admitting that the task can be realized, and the argument of Zeno finally shows that there is a contradiction in admitting that the task has been realized, that is, that Achilles arrived at the end of the race and that Achilles reached the tortoise. Still, we need to admit that we can take as a fact that emotion has been there. And so taken as a fact that emotion be there required for explaining the structure of motion that is both its continuity and its intrinsic infinity, that is its divisibility. To tackle and solve this problem, no analysis is enough. An account of the synthetic act of moving is required. Aristotle is once more perfectly explicit on this point. Here what is right, but this solution holds up adequately for the questioner, since it was asked if it is possible to go through or to count infinities in infinite time, but for the fact itself and the truth does not adequately holds up. So I definitely won the quarrel with Zeno because I definitely showed that it's wrong, but still I did explain nothing. For if someone leaving aside the length and the question whether it is possible to go through infinities and infinite time, inquired into these things about the time itself, for the time admits infinite division, this solution would not longer be adequate. To reiterate, Aristotle does in no way claim that his previous dissolution of the alleged paradox is inadequate. As a reply to them, he merely observes that as unsubstantial as they may be as such, these alleged paradoxes raise a difficult question that require a distinct and independent treatment. The passage Aristotle makes follow his claim is a masterpiece of clarity, deepness, and consciousness, for it presents in a few lines the most fundamental kernel of his conception of continuity. Here what he says, if someone divides a continuum into two halves, deals with a single point as if it were two, for he makes in both a beginning and an end. But divided in this way, neither the line nor the motion will be continuous. For a continuous motion is a continuum, and in the continuum there are indeed infinite halves, but not in entelechy, only in power. But if the halves were made in entelechy, I will explain later what he means by entelechy. But if the halves were made in entelechy, it would not result a continuous, and the motion would stop, which is indeed what clearly happens in counting the halves, for one point necessarily counts as two, the end of one half and the beginning of the other. So what is the point? If you have a continuum, can I write here or no? If I have a continuum and I cut it, this is no more continuum because I made of this point the end of this and the beginning of this. And so here there is something that marked as continuum. So the motion of Achilles is continuous. It is when I mark a division that I make a discontinuous. So the discontinuous in my account, not in the motion itself. If I had to comment on this passage in the light of Barbara Sattler's explanation of Aristotle's views on continuity in a recent beautiful book, The Concept of Motion, that, by the way, I suggest to you, I think that is really a fantastic book in the same time for different reasons. One reason, now I will make you smile. One reason this book is really clear. I think I never read a book so clear about the thesis that she presents. So if you want to criticize her, it's very easy because it's absolutely clear. On the other side, I think that this book goes deeply on something very superficial on other things. So it's a book that really is good in some sense, also in what is not, in my point of view, very good, because it does not only make clearly what she wants to present, but it also make clear what you would like to go a little bit further. Okay? So if I had to comment on a passage in the light on Barbara's explanation of Aristotle's view on continuity in a recent beautiful book, The Concept of Motion, The Concept of Motion, I would say that Aristotle is here making clear that for him, the whole-part relation goes in the opposite way than for Zeno. While the latter gives priority to part that constitutes the whole, the former gives priority to the whole from which part may be derived. I agree. This is what Barbara Sattler says. But I'd like to say something more, by beginning with a reflection on Aristotle's notion of infinity by division. In the interest of time, from now on, I will be less attentive to Aristotle's phrasing and rather present my understanding in a quote general way. The future book, by too much time in the making, written together with Giovanna Giardina and Chiara Martini, will be, provided it will ever exist, much more precise and faithful to the details of Aristotle's text. It is about 15 years that Giovanna and me, we are writing this book. And we added Chiara, that was my student in Bologna, by the way, 10 years ago. And we have a chapter after now. But we have a good of ideas in our mind. Aristotle's distinction between infinite according to the division and infinite as the extreme can certainly be viewed as a particular case of the more general distinction between potential infinite and actual infinite, so often ascribed to Aristotle, or better considered as one of his main theoretical innovations. The latter distinction is only apparently plain, however, the one between potential and actual infinity. More than that, it is often misunderstood. Appealing to it in order to explain the former distinction between infinite by division and infinite by the extreme is then dangerous and likely misleading, if no prior clarification is offered. There is no doubt that in his analysis of infinity, in Physics 3, for instance, Aristotle denies that infinite can exist in act, namely under the form of a physical body of whatever other magnitude extended beyond any boundary, or a number greater than any other number, or even more generally, any sensible item, including object, event of any sort of phenomena, given at once as a whole and admitting no limit in one or more dimensions. So nothing like that is possible. For Aristotle, this is absolutely clear. So it's clear that Aristotle tells it. It's not clear that it's right. It is clear that Aristotle thinks about this way. This provides a basis for arguing against Eleatics and atomists, among others. In doing that, Aristotle first holds in agreement with the Eleatics and in disagreement with the atomists that divisibility in principle cannot be stopped at will, so that admitting it necessary entails admitting endless divisibility. Then he denies the infinite in act, or rejects the Eleatic's claim that the admission of endless divisibility of the one would have entailed the admission of its eventual infinite division, so that the only possible still remain that infinite exists dynamei. So the point of the Eleatic is there is no potential division if there is no actual division. The power, the potency, is only a potency of a possible future. So if there is power and division in power, there is also division in act. There cannot be infinite division in act, so there is no division in power. And Aristotle, this is the point of Aristotle. Do the Eleat right in arguing that potentiality is the anticipation of an act? This is the point. And Aristotle cannot argue for that, because for him there is no infinite in act. So it cannot be infinite in potency as an anticipation of the future infinite in act. Okay? So how can we argue that there is infinite in power if we accept that there is no infinite in act and we accept that power is only possibility of a future act? This passage is often mentioned while arguing for Aristotle's stance in favor of potential infinity. Things are not so straightforward, however. Since for Aristotle nothing exists that can only be in power, the notion of dynamis individuates for him the possibility that something transforms or better realize itself in a certain way by acquiring some feature that it has still not, but that nothing forbids it will have in future. This is, for instance, the case of a certain piece of bronze which has the power to be a certain statue. It is not this statue, but nothing prevents it will be so. So the piece of bronze is in potency a statue because it will be able to become a statue. then it's possible that it will never become, but nothing prevents it to become. Even if nothing can ensure it will be. Or also the case of a fertilized seed, which has the power to be a man. It will become a man, unless some accident will prevent it from it. By identifying what an entity can be, but still is not, power identifies the not being of a thing. But for Aristotle, not being is not absolutely so as for Parmenides. It is rather the not being of a specific thing. For instance, a piece of bronze is not being of the charioteer of Delphi. So there is no not being without being for Aristotle. Because accepting the idea that there is not being without being would be to concede to Parmenides all his philosophy. For Aristotle, so there is a problem with infinite impotency, if there is no infinite in act. For Aristotle, it is then not possible to speak of non-being without referring to a being. As a consequence, for an entity being potentially something, that is, it's not being, but being able to be these things, is determined by the being of this very thing. For instance, our piece of bronze is not the charioteer of Delphi, all in force of the being of the charioteer of Delphi, which this piece of bronze can be, and perhaps will be in future. Act is prior to power, ontologically speaking, as it is made clear in Metaphysics Theta. Since it is only based on being that not being is admitted, it is only based on the actual hen that one can admit that the X is potentially hen. The problem with the notion of potential infinity becomes then evident. How can infinite be in power, provided that power requires act, and there is no infinite in act? Aristotle clearly sees the problem, of course, but it was not stupid, Aristotle. Here is how he goes ahead, just after the passage quoted above from Physics 3.6, where he makes the distinction between infinite and active in power. But here, one should not intend in power, as in this is potentially a status, or as this will be a status, also the infinite will be in act. So the status is in power, the charioteers of Delphi, in a different way, sense in which the infinite is in power. The case of the infinity is then peculiar. The same relation between power and act that applies to the bronze and the status does not apply here. For being infinite in power does not go together with the possibility of infinite in act. But there is more, since it is entails that infinite, which does not exist in power, just for this very reason can, strictly speaking, no more exist in power. Sorry, that does not exist in act. Sorry, just for this reason can, strictly speaking, not exist in power. To follow through his own claim that infinite exists dunamei, Aristotle needs then a third option, allowing to make the existence of the infinite be neither in act, if this is conceived as an accomplished condition that obtain and persist as such, nor in power, if it is conceived as the possibility of being in act in the same sense. The problem is not solved, strictly speaking, with the introduction of another modality of being in power. This is what we could expect. Another modality of being in power. The power that requires future act and the power which does not require future act. Aristotle moves rather the introduction of another modality of being in act, according to which being in act is not an accomplished condition that obtains and persists as such. The two modalities of being in act are expressed through two different Greek terms, both coined by Aristotle himself. Aristotle invented these two words, which in many translations of Aristotle's text are unfortunately rendered in the same way, so you understand nothing. Using act and cogniate, energeia and entelecheia. The first term occurs in the passage quoted above from 3.6, where Aristotle argues that in the case of the infinite, being in power is not to be intended as if the infinite will be in act, namely energeia. also the second term occurs in a passage quoted above, the passage from 8:8, where Aristotle argues that the halves of the continuum are there only in power, not in entelechy, namely hoc and telekia. Since if they were this last way, the continuum would not be continuous. In the first quote, not being in act of the infinite is opposed to the being so of the statum. This should be enough to make clear that this sort of act is just that of an accomplished and persistent condition, the condition that makes a statum a statum. In the second quote, the not being in entelechy of the halves or in general the part of a continuum is opposed to its being one as such, which can certainly be divided in halves or parts, but as not as its purpose, its telos, that of being divided. The point is less clear here, though it seems to be that the continuum is not that which is continuously divided. It is divisible just because it is neither already divided, not in essence or by nature, ancestry in the very process of being divided. The term entelekia seems then to have been coined by Aristotle to indicate a mode of being in the process of proceeding toward the telos. Entelekia, there's the telos here, is going toward the telos. So the basic idea is the entelekia is the act of being towards the telos. I am in act of moving. I am in act of becoming. I am in act of being what I will be. So the infinite is in power, not strictly in power, is in power in the sense that it is in the act of being in power, if I can explain myself. Let's see, as opposite of the mode of being in the condition of having reached it, an act which is by its own nature of being evolving, not only can coexist, but essentially coexist with being in power, something that will never be without denying itself. For as for the piece of bronze, that it is not properly in the condition of having the possibility of becoming the charioteer of Delhi, but is in becoming it, in the very process of acquiring the form of the charioteer. And because of that, is no longer the raw bronze that he was, stored in the workshop of the sculptor, who did not begin working on it, yet and still not the state what they will be when it will no longer be in the process of being molded, or even more clearly, as the motion itself, as it were, is no longer at rest in the starting position, and still not at rest in the final position, and that Aristotle explicitly defined as the entelechy of what is in power, insofar as it is as such. So the entelechy is an act of evolving, an act of being in the process. This very definition of motion is in itself the best positive description of the task Achilles is performing. He is running toward the end of the track or after the tortoise. The reason for the halves of the track, or the points in which the tortoise successively is, do not divide his running in an actual infinite of parts that he has to cover the one after the other, in so performing an impossible super task, is simply that Achilles running. He is in the entelechy of his very moving. And just as this running, and in general any motion is in being a motion, the infinity is in the same time act qua entelekia to not act qua energeia, and the power. But a deep difference exists, at least in the case of the distinct particular motion other than the first one. While this motion goes towards the telos, which makes them stop by transforming in rest, and are then rest in power, the infinite go towards no telos, which makes it accomplished and makes it in act qua energeia. It is not, as Aristotle quite vividly said, infinite, that outside of which there is nothing, but that outside of which there is always something. Far what being merely in power, Aristotle infinite is then also in act in a crucial sense. More than that, it is a sense, in essence, identity of power and act. If it were not so, but only power, it would not be infinite in any sense. since it would be waiting for a continuation, rather than in the process of a continuing division or growing. It is just because of this that observing that both the track and the time are infinite by division provides a clear and definitive dissolution of Zeno's alleged paradoxes. If track and time were infinite purely in power, the division may stop at a certain stage, and the Achilles was never stopped, without accomplishing the track or reaching the tortoise. One might then say that there was no need to wait for the Zorg point at infinity, Newton fluxion and Leibniz differential, or Cantor ordinals and cardinals to enter the paradise of actual infinity. In a sense, at least, Aristotle gave us already the keys of this paradise, but under the form of entelecheia, not under the form of energeia. This account of potential infinity makes an account of continuity urgent. Since if the infinity by division is potential in the way just described, and what is divisible is a continuous, continuity is to be explained as that which makes the entelechy of division possible, namely that which allows division to be protectable as apeiron. As you all know, Aristotle presented two apparent definitions of the continuum in physics. Perhaps you all know, but it's very well known, which even if they were equivalent, do not certainly appear as immediately so. Once repeated twice in 3.1 and 6.2 in terms of infinite divisibility. The other advanced once in 5.3 in terms of being one of the limit of parts. The first question to be asked in trying to understand this definition is, what do they define? The continuum as a separate, presumably abstract object, or the continua, or better, that which make distinct sort of particular items continuum, the property of being a continuous and continuity, the continuity which is short by all these items, each of which is independently given as such. My answer, which I cannot justify here, is definitely the second, which entails that Aristotle known phrase the continuum to synekes does not work as a specific proper name, but as a descriptor, Drew, good for you, as referring to that which is continuous. The second question is, which definition? That of 3.1 or 6.2 in terms of infinite divisibility, or that of 5.3 in terms of being one of the limits of parts? According to the former, here is the Greek, which might be translated either as that which is a continuum is infinitely divisible, or as infinite divisible is a continuous. What is infinite divisible is a continuous. Here the Greek is ambiguous. And you understand the difference, because in one sense it to be a necessary and sufficient condition, in another sense it to be only a sufficient, a necessary and not sufficient condition. And this is the other definition, which is less ambiguously to be translated as a continuous is that which is divisible into part, always divisible. According to the latter, 5.2, which according to a plausible and as fightable as possible translation, tell us that something is continuous when the limit, singular, in which each of its two parts join each other becomes the same and one, and as the name points out, hold with. And as the name points out, because synekes is synekes. So soon. Being taken together in some sense. Literally speaking, synekes is taken together. Sorry?
Yeah, it's the root of symptom.
Synekes means all together. Yes. Yeah. In sune is what in Latin becomes cum, and what now becomes with in English. In her book, Barbara Sattler has suggested to consider these definitions complementary to each other. The former would define the monadic predicate A is continuous, the latter would define the adiatic predicate A is continuous with B. I agree that these claims are complementary, but I'm sure neither that they should both count as genuine definitions, nor that they are complementary in this way. I have different reasons to consider that the former cannot count as a genuine definition. Here's one. Take a pair of wooden bars. two wooden bars. They can be infinitely divided. First divide one from the other, then divide the first in half, the second in half, the first into 4, the second into 4, etc. But it seems hard to imagine that a pair of wooden bars might be taken as a continuum item for Aristotle. There are two after all, if not under some appropriate particular conditions. I hear you protesting. A pair of bars is not an item. It is rather formed by two distinct items, each of which is both infinitely divisible, as presumably continuous for Aristotle. Surely. But this is just one. For Aristotle, a way in which the one is said to be so is by continuity, the attempt Sunekeian. And it seems clear that a pair of bars is made by two items just because each of them is a continuum. But when taken together, they do not form a continuum. And to object to my example, I just said that there are two, we need to already have a clear notion of what is continuous, which is what does it mean to be one, which makes each bar, but not the pair of them, a continuum. And it seems hard to imagine how infinite divisibility might make it, provided that, to reject my objection, one has already to admit that the pair is not one. The example may be made much more sophisticated, but by using a piece of mathematical knowledge which was very familiar to Aristotle, since he mentioned it pervasively in his text. It's interesting that Aristotle mentioned it really a lot of time, but he never discussed it really. He takes always it as common notion. You know, it's clear as in the case of the diagonal in the side, as the case of the side and the diagonal show that. So there is no analysis of these cases, but the case is repeated in any example. On the diagonal of a square, take a segment marked by the point S equal to the side. Divide the segment in the middle point D2 of the diagonal. The middle point of the diagonal, not of the segment. Then in its successive halves, each of which is taken on the previous half containing T2, so that the successive divisions are marked by point S2, S4, S8, etc. The segment is divided into two parts by point D2, but is still infinitely divisible in this way or in other infinitely many ways, in successive third, successive fifth, etc., none of which has D2 as a dividing point. Clearly, its infinite divisibility is in no way affected by the fact that the point D2 is supposed to be removed from it or left or it, or even actualized on it by the first division. Still, it seems also clear that removing or even only actualizing this point on this segment affects its continuity according to Aristotle's conception. As infinite divisibility of a segment, or even more the availability of infinitely many ways of realizing an infinite division of it, do not seem to be equivalent to its continuity according to his conception. So I repeat the argument. Take this point actualized, the segment is not continuous. Still, you can divide it infinite of time without never arriving at it. Take this point not to be actualized, again, the point is the continuous, you can divide it exactly as before. This seems to speak again the idea that infinite divisibility of a given item might be taken as a sufficient condition for the continuity of its item. Sufficient, necessary, of course. But it seems to be perfectly compatible, both with considering that, according to Aristotle, infinite divisibility is a crucial property of continua, or to the fact that ensuring that something is a continuum is enough to ensure its infinite divisibility. As it happened both for Achilles' track and the time it takes to cover it. And with agreeing with Barbara Sattler that what makes a continuous is the part word relation that characterizes it, as well as that the definition of 5.3 is there to fix this relation. So this is not the point, simply. It cannot be the point. It is, however, difficult to understand how this definition made at the same time fix this relation and define the dyadic predicate A is continuous with B. Since if it did fix this last relation, this definition would at most fix the condition under which two items come to fuse into a single continuous item, which is far not the same as achieving this very item as a continuum. In other terms, there is no way to explain what does it mean to be continuous while referring to the divisibility. To say the same in another way, this definition can provide a condition under which two items come to fuse into a single continuous item only while fixing the condition that makes a single item a continuum, that is a genuine one, by so establishing what makes the two given items two single distinct items and that which result from the appropriate fusion a new single distinct item. This suggests understanding the compatibility and the complementarity of Aristotle's claims of 3.1, 6.2, and 5.3 as follows. The first two claims fix a crucial and highly relevant property of continuum, that is the infinite divisibility. The third claim fixes the condition that make a continuum be a continuum, and then have this property. If Aristotle's continuous is to be intended as that which is continuous, fixing this condition is, however, not the same as describing an abstract separate object, but rather the same as conceptually describing the essential nature of particular continua, which makes them continua. And as these continua are primarily physical entities, such as bodies, event, magnitude, lapses of time, and even the time itself, being possibly mathematical one as line or surfaces only by abstraction, this reduced to a phenomenological description as opposed to a mathematical definition. The question that the claim of 5.3 seems to answer is then a fundamental phenomenological problem of an empirical inquiry, the problem of providing a conceptual characterization of an essential salient feature of the constituents of the physical world, which makes, by the way, this constituent, when regarded as subject of a mathematical act, infinitely divisible. So the point is exactly what makes of Achilles run one. Definition 5.3 is the last one in a succession of 8 explicit divisions. I have 7-8 minutes, which are displayed by the following 3, which also display their dependency relation. So Aristotle defined together up intermediate joint concept. 5 of this definition, those of together, apart, joint, and consecutive continuous, are definition of binary relations. That of intermediate is the definition of ternary relation. The definition of changing continuously by nature is that of a monadic property. And despite Aristotle, unfortunately, phrasing is independent of that of the continuum. So these does not depend on that. Otherwise, there would be circularity. Zug, I disagree with Barbara Sutter in taking also this last definition as that of a binary relation. I see it as a definition of a monadic property resulting from a limit case of a binary relation between the putative part of the relevant items, namely, as it were, from a degenerate binary relation among these parts, which, because of the degeneration, converts in a global monadic property. My following explanation will make this point clearer, I hope. In the interest of time, I cannot enter the entangling details of all this definition. The only thing I can do is outlining what I take to be the essential point of the definition of the continuum. Aristotle makes the definition preceded by the claim that the continuum is just some contiguous. To explain which sort of contiguous is the continuous, he plays with an ambiguity among the plural of a relation and the singular of a property, or of an item having it. He claims that the contiguous is continuous when a limit, per us in the singular, becomes the same and one, which makes severally, presumably, two items hold with. To better understand the point, we need to quickly go back through the succession of definition. In a nutshell, Aristotle claimed that two items are contiguous if and only if they are both consecutive and joined, namely they admit no intermediate of the same kind, which make them consecutive, and their extremity are together, which make them joined. Hence, an item is a continuum when the limit of its consecutive parts are not only joined, but are such that their limit in the singular become the same and one. This is the definition, essentially. The difficulty of understanding as a single limit can become the same and one is only a terminological aspect of another deeper difficulty. This appears when we observe that according to Aristotle's definition, two things are together with respect to the place when they are in one primary place. The place is that which include that of which it is the place. And the primary place is neither smaller nor bigger. So Aristotle has not the idea of place as container. The place of a thing is exactly where this thing is, which makes it hard to understand both how it may happen that two distinct items be together and what one may require more for the extremity of two consecutive parts than being together, for they also be the same and one. The problem is made plastically manifest if we follow Ross in taking Aristotle as asserting that for an item to be continuous, the limit of its continuous part are not namely to be ama, the limit are not made to be ama together, but are rather to be n one. Which makes the question arise of understanding how the condition that the limit of two consecutive parts of a given item be ama, which makes this part contiguous, differs from the condition that makes limits be n, which makes this item a continuum. Ross himself has suggested two possible solutions. Two items having a place are ama together if they are the same item discharging two functions, namely if they are intentionally two, so being extensionally one. Whereas they are n if they also discharge the same function, namely they are also intentionally one. Two items having a place, first solution. Second solution, two items having a place are ama if they are distinct items contained in one place which only contains them, namely if they are extensionally two occupying the same primary place, whereas they are n if they are the same item, namely they are extensionally one to possibly discharging two functions, and then being extensionally two. If we admit to understand how two distinct items can be in the same primary place, the second solution seems to make this a continuum, because it is only one point. They discharge two different functions. It is one point, so it is one extension. Since the limit of these two apparent parts is extensionally one, namely the same point is both the right limit of one part and the left limit of the other. According to the first solution, this is still not a continuum, since to extensionally one, the common limit of these two parts is intentionally two, by discharging the two distinct functions of being the right limit of one part and the left limit of the other. So that this part as contiguous, but do not form a continuum. This conclusion seems, however, to be contradicted by many of the arguments Aristotle advanced in 8.8, to argue that the only motion, this conclusion, that is the fact that this is a continuum. Aristotle in 8.8 argued that the only motion that can be continuous is eternally protracted. If eternally protracted is the circular displacement or fora, which entails, and Aristotle said is entailed by the claim that the rectilinear displacement eternally protracted cannot be continuous. To support the last claim, Aristotle argues that the rectilinear displacement cannot cover an infinite trajectory in length and is then forced to change its direction and then to stop in the point. This does. So the point of Aristotle is that if I go this way, I stop there because I change the direction. Among others, the following arguments seem to be particularly relevant for our present issue. Everything that is moved continuously without being driven out by anything moves towards that it was displacing beforehand. Arguing Aristotle does that it is so for a circular displacement, namely that a circular displacement never changes direction, depends, of course, on a conception of punctual speed and inertia radically different from our one. This difference being granted, Aristotle's argument clearly entails that the displacement along this cannot be continuous, which suggests that the broken line can neither be so for him because it changes direction. It only remains then the second solution, which Ross discards from quite immaterial reason. This raises another problem, however, that of understanding how the common limit of two consecutive parts of a continuum can also be intentionally one. That is how it can happen that it does not discharge two functions at once. So how can we have a common limit of two parts that is not the left of one and the right of the other? Like that of being the final part of one part and the initial limit of the other part. This problem has a possible solution, nonetheless, which makes Aristotle's definition clear. The parts of a continuum are not actual and have then no actual limit. The only function that the potential limit can discharge is that of being possibly actualized by then becoming, because of that, only because of that, intentionally distinct. This suggests that the point Aristotle wants to make, which is definition, is that a continuum is that which has no actual parts, that on which no limit of any part is actual, or has been actualized by an act that inevitably breaks the continuity. This allows coming back to Zeno's logoi with a new perspective in mind. To this purpose, notice that the previous argument about rectilinear and circular displacement occur in the same chapter 8.8, where Aristotle comes back on the dichotomy, and which also contains the two other passages that follow. One, some line before this motion, the other, some line after it. First passage, there being three things, the beginning, the middle, and the end. The middle is such in relation to each of the others, and is one in number, but not in logos. Still, one thing is the power, and another the act. For each point of the straight line between the extremity is the middle in power, but not in act, unless it divides the line in such a way that the mobile stops and starts moving again. In this way, the middle becomes beginning and end, beginning of the next and end of the previous. The point that divides the time is common to both the earlier and the latter, and is the same and one n in number, but not the same in logos, the end of the earlier, the beginning of the latter. Taking the track and the time that Aristotle takes to cover, that Achilles takes to cover it to be continuous and equally potentially divisible, is then the same as taking his motion not to stop in any of the potential points of division. And this is the appropriate description of this run, which make not only the paradox dissolve, but also its setting present no phenomenological oddity. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for your patience, because I was a little bit long, I suppose. Okay, questions, remark, protestations, objection. Ben.
So changing direction destroys continuity, if I understood the last.
Changing direction. Changing direction.
But it seems to me that on a circle, for instance, you're always changing direction if you follow. So a circle.
This is what I clearly said. Here Aristotle is accepting a notion of inertia that is not the same as other. The idea that the inertia rectilinear is introduced much later in the history of science and appear essentially with Descartes. So clearly Aristotle is accepting that the circular motion does not change the direction. So we can deny it, we can say that this idea of inertia, so of punctual speed, is not a good one, but this has nothing to do with the question of continuity. Aristotle accepted the idea that a motion never changes direction. But why? Because the direction is identified by the chaos. And in the circle, the chaos does not change. The chaos will be external. In any case, the question is not to defend this idea of inertia. This idea of inertia is clearly physical enough. That's not the point. The point is another. The point is using this idea of inertia. It can argue that circular motion is continuous because it does not change the direction.
The motion is uniform in a sense. It's
never change the direction, so it can be continuous. Any other motion cannot be continuous because necessarily it internally protracted to change the direction. Go, but they cannot go to the direction. So that's here I change the direction. I stop the continuum.
So what kind of stands out to me about Zeno's paradox?
Sorry?
What's interesting, or like the thing I'm thinking about is it's a very physical paradox. It's not like we're not describing some mathematical abstraction. It's like a man running. And I was wondering why, like they're asking a question about the physical world in a sense, and why are they maybe it's just a different time, but why do they think they can sort of solve this physical question by just like abstract reasoning? Like, wouldn't there want to like physically check that maybe time can be divided the same way as space or something? Like it's not.
I don't understand the question. Yeah.
I guess to me, if I saw a thing that was a question about the physical world, kind of the way Zeno's paradox appears to be, I would suspect that the way to solve it would be to carry out experiments in the physical world instead of trying to like talk about definition. So I was wondering, is that something they thought, or do they just conceive of physics and philosophy different than I do now? Or
physics for Aristotle is not the same of physics for us. So now, but there is a very important step that Aristotle does in the direction of physics as we understand with respect to pre-Socratic philosophy. The point of Aristotle is that physics is the appropriate conceptual description of what happened in the world, and that this conceptual description are to use appropriate concept category. And so the question of the physics of Aristotle is the question of making clear that this concept of time, space, infinity, continuum, etc. So this is what Aristotle does in the book of Description of Physics, to explain, clarify this basic conceptual building block of the description of the standard line. So we cannot accept the conclusion of Aristotle, the paradox, simply because the paradox denies something that is manifest in front of us. I need then to have a conceptual apparatus that allows me to make it clear, to make possible for a case to move and not to deny its motion, because its motion makes manifest, not its move. All that has. Whereas in the case of the Eleatics, the philosophy was a simply abstract reflection of the being, of the division, and what happened in the world is irrelevant because the philosophers are much farther from the world in their abstract world of pure logic. So Aristotle is the first one to say, no, we need to look at what are the world is. And we need to identify the good conceptual notion that allows us to describe it. This being said, of course, the physics of Aristotle is not experimental physics. That is quite clear. And is not even mathematical physics. Mathematics is, at the contrary, something that we can extract from physics. No idea of physics as we can describe. But if I could answer your question in this way, Aristotle is certainly far to our conception of what a physical inquiry is, but is enormously closer to this conception than the pre-Socratic philosophy.
I'm curious if, there wasn't much discussion about the distinction between rational numbers and real numbers, and whether Aristotle would think that the interval 0, 1 restricted to the rational numbers is continuum, because it's infinitely divisible, of course, but nowadays we don't consider it a continuum because it's full of holes in other ways.
So Aristotle has no notion of real number, and Euclid has no notion of real number. What Aristotle knows, and the example show, is that does not tell it in this way. I think that it would have said it well. The rational number does not enough will come from the fact of the segment. An all point in the segment and rational. He could not have said it in this way, but in another way. Clear. The example that I made here was perfectly clear to Aristotle. This point can never be reached by rational divisions. And not only can never be reached by rational division in two, it can never be reached by any sort of rational division. This is exactly what is understood by the argument of the... Okay, so this is clear. Now, from here to say, Aristotle is arguing that the rational number do not form a continuity, and the interval 0, 1 of real number is the real continuum, that is to ascribe too much to him. By the way, this is, I insisted on it, I don't know whether I was clear. For Aristotle, the question of continuity is in no way a mathematical question. The question of the continuity is a physical question. What we need to do is to describe which make one. One, make it one. This is what we have to describe. And then once we once we have made it, and we have a clear characterization of it, so we can say that, okay, I can take a segment as a sort of form of this. Not the table, what is on the edge, on the edge of the table, and insofar I have described that the continuity of the table as a continuity in the 3 dimension, also the edge will be continuous, also the segment will be continuous. But the problem of the continuity for Aristotle is in no way a mathematical problem, it's a physical problem. This is, it seems to me, quite clear. By the way, no problem is a mathematical problem. Aristotle never wrote about maths. Aristotle was clear in overall mathematics, he mentioned mathematics in many occasions. There is a fantastic book by Heath, let us say, that made the edition of Euclid about mathematics in Aristotle. So you can find a lot of part where Aristotle mentioned mathematics, but he never mentioned mathematics in the original way. Has nothing to do new of mathematics. He's only used mathematics to develop example, analogies, argument. At the contrary, Aristotle has a lot to say about physics. This is a place in which he gives original contributions. So it's not clear whether Aristotle does not give original contribution to mathematics because it does not know enough mathematics, because he was hating Plato, that he was a mathematician, or because he simply considered that it's not relevant to speak about mathematics. The fact is that Aristotle practically never speaks of mathematics. A lot of of mathematics, and use mathematics, but very rarely speak about mathematics as a mathematician or a philosopher of mathematics may do. When he tried to give some sort of a philosophy of mathematics in answering Plato in a book, Mu of the Metaphysics, is of confusion. Terrible. There is a long discussion about how to interpret this book. Different interpretations have been suggested. Once I have tried to make a clear panorama of that, I identified 4 different interpretations, and each one of them is compatible with the text. Simply the texts are confused. Aristotle does not make it clearly. Aristotle says, okay, there is a problem here. Aristotle, the mathematical object, the mathematica came from abstraction, but what they are, you can say that Aristotle, Plato said that they are intermediary between things and idea, but it's not clear whether he accepts his idea or not. Apparently, they denied his idea, but so is and I know the story. Aristotle is not a philosopher; he's a philosopher of physics, and the problem of continuity is physics. It's a phenomenological problem. We want to describe what there is, and we want to describe what is more fundamental of what there is: unity. What makes this one chair? This is the top to have. What makes this one chair and make this 2 chairs? Why? This is not a big problem. You really not a big problem.
So you would consider, for example, a piece of iron to be continuum, a continuum?
Yes. Yes. If the piece of iron does not mark any sign of division, then of course this is conditional definition. In the sense that then you should explain what is the sign of division. This is another story. But I suppose if the piece of iron were away, you would say, no, I see that distinction. So in some sense, the continuity is there when there is no in French it says science. What is science? What is the science? Nothing that came from the uniformity in such a way to attract your attention. There is no point of crisis in catastrophe theory, the point of catastrophe. There is no singularity. There is no singularity. The continuity is that sense of singularity.
So this notion of being one is, there has to be intentional reading. I don't see any other way around that. Now, is this a carpet or is this a carpet? Well, it's actually you can see it.
This is an important point that Aristotle makes. We can say once in different way, and you say we can take one in function of what we take to be one. And he make the example of a pair of shoes. We can say of a pair of shoes, one, because we take them, but there is a difference between our take something to be one and the base of this thing of system one.
Right.
So we can decide to think as one when we ascribe to them a singular function, and so we make an intentional act, taking them unity. And Aristotle described it as different notion of unity. So there are different notions of unity. One of them is this, but there is an original notion of unity that is continuity. And the continuity is clear, not a particular case of the pair of shoes. Pair of shoes is not continuous. They are one, but in another sense, because we take to be one them.
So there should be something, the broken line should be something in between the pair of shoes and the segment. Because on the one side, they are not 2 separate things. But in the other hand,
I totally agree with you. But Aristotle, again, was not stupid. No. Absolutely. Absolutely, but look here. Let me arrive here where it is.
See about. We have
No, where it is.
a person,
What?
like a human, would they be contiguous?
Exactly, this is what I want to find. The three I did not find. Aristotle defined 7 different notions. And these 7 different notions are just made there to make this distinction and to give enough concept to describe in different cases. I will find the 3 here. It is a system of working that there is no way to go. And the real problem is exactly this one, what to make a contiguous distinct of continua. And the broken line seems to be an example of contiguous. The shoes are even not an example of contiguous. I found that I will be clear. Here. So, the segment or the piece of iron, the broken line, the joined. I put it together. Consecutive, there is nothing of the same sort within them. So these are consecutive. Consecutive chairs, yes, but because there is no chair in the middle, even there is a lot of other things can be in the middle. Intermediate. This is intermediate between the two, apart, distinct, and ama, and the problem is here. What is the relation between ama and continuous? Is what I have discussed today. But in any case, it's true that there are a difference. There is a difference between the fuses. The fuses are consecutive in some sense. There is, when I say a pair of fuses, there are only 2 fuses, there is not a third in the middle. Okay, but I can take a fuses as one because I use them. So that is another story. This is an intentional notion of unity. And Aristotle is clear about the fact that one can be said in a different way. There's a long passage in category in the long passage in metaphysics where he explains that one can be said in a different way. The point is that one of the ways in which one can be said is continuity.
Yeah, so question about these 2 distinct notions of continuity with 2 definitions. I think they notion of continuity, the 2 definitions, right? So you said not immediately equivalent to one another. Right? This is pretty clear.
The definition, yes.
Yeah. So, but if I understood correctly, right? So what you think is that the second one, 153, that's the real definition of continuity, and then infinite divisibility is like the property that we think that's your property.
This is my thesis, yes.
So shouldn't we expect that kind of like an argument or proof that the second definition entails infinite divisibility? And so
yes, this argument I think that can be said and given in Aristotle sense. And I also try to give it in a total, but that's insofar as though a continuous is something that has no singularity, but where you can take a singularity. Just because you can take a singularity on, there is no reason to think that if you can take it, just because there is no singularity, you can take a singularity on here. There is no reason to think that you cannot take a singularity also here, because otherwise this and this would be distinct, so there would be a singularity. So if it's divisible once, it's divisible by infinity, exactly because I have no singularity. This is the point. The point is why they can be divided once. This is it remains problematic. But the fact that that does not present singularity is clearly an argument for the infinite divisibility. If I can divide everywhere. Because otherwise there would be point distant from us, there would be singularity, and there is no singularity. It's clear what you mean? This is not an argument Aristotle made.
Okay, yeah, well, because it was part of the question, so whether it's.
No, I never find that this argument Aristotle. It seems to me that he would have.
And so just to understand a bit better what this definition part three is saying that, right, so. So this is not saying that continuum has no parts.
It does not say the continuous no part, no. It say, let me see whether I found, is a very difficult question, the definitions. Let's find the passage. So here you point you put the point in a very difficult point. So what happened? Aristotle gave these three definitions. Two, in fact, because one is repeated twice. And the first time that he goes, the first definition that is which seems to be continuous, that which is divisible in part, infinitely divisible. In one of the two, in the first occurrence, it simply say is a infinitely divisible is a necessary condition for continuity. So the Greek is not clear, but to translate in this way is not to force the text too much. In the second case, translating in this way requires forcing the text. So Aristotle really seems to say if that is continuously working, so clearly seems to say that infinitely is the essential property of continuity equal infinity.
But
It is.
just that, so what I'm thinking is that what seems important for Aristotle isn't just infinite visibility, but for something to be a continuum, arbitrary. Meaning, not only is it the case that you could have divided this in a mole somewhere else, you could have divided it anywhere else.
Let me finish.
And that's what makes it different from the rationals, because
let me finish what we are. Here is there are two problems. One is the philosophical problem, the other is the theological. I cannot solve the philosophical problem without both the theological. So the theological problem is the following. Three things that seem to be a definition. In the two same definition is infinite divisibility, and the other unit of them. In one of the two infinite divisibility, you can read as it is in the concept, not the definition. So we can know it is not the definition, and it's what we say. In the other, simply effective, let's say, what it is equal to what is the but on the other side, there is not only that definition too, where this is not mentioned, but in book 6, when it begins to discuss the question of the infinite divisibility of time and space, he said, if continuous is outside, and the reference is explicit to the definition. So anytime, the only time that you refer to the previous definition as a definition of continuity, that is based on, in order to argue, to exist the reference to the definition. So there are here two theologically speaking, two contradictory things. Not only there are two definitions, but one definition seems to be necessary to the condition, and the other, that when the condition of continuity appeared to is not the definition that appeared by the other. So I consider also that we now read Aristotle physics are one treatise. There are a lot of discussion about whether it was one treatise, three different treatises. One thinks that one thinks was book 1 and 2, another was book 3, 4, 5, 6, and another was book 7 and 8. And someone thinks that book 7 was at the event, it was completely outside, so the book 8 was a treatise, the book 6 was a 6 and 5 was a treatise, and that was another treatise. So it's also possible that Aristotle changes his mind, and then things were put together. In any case, the philological, the point is clear. There is no way to solve the problem philologically, because there are traces as in the philology, give argument to think the first definition is the good definition, you give argument to say the second definition is the good definition. But not only, when Aristotle in the category thinks about unity and says the unity in a different way, one is continuity, he repeats the definition of five, not the one that repeat the definition of book 5. So it's the definition of book 5 appear in two different books of Aristotle, physics, book 5, and category, the definition as a need of the continuity appear twice in the physics in two different books. In these cases, I think that philology is the problem, but that's not all. So one solution is to say, okay, the two definitions are complementary. The solution of Barbara Sattler is very simple. They define two different things. The first define the property of being continuous as a property, the second define the relation. This seems to me not a good solution because it seems to me that to be continuous with, so to say, the problem that I said before, if I play to bar, if the line is invisible, okay, I divide nine, that is invisible. But say you is not a good example because I took, okay, but what made it two? And so my way of thinking is that what I suggest is the following. Operatively speaking, what is relevant for continuity is infinite divisibility. So if I want to make it clear what I can do with the continua, I say, okay, I can divide them infinitely. But if I want to speak from the point of view of the essence, what make the continua continue, what make the infinite divisibility divisible, so I need to go at another level that I have not only to say what we can make with the continua, I also need to say what make them continua and the definition. So I read the things that then, so sorry, Eric wanted to speak, then I saw James, and then you and then.
Yeah, so this is not a question about Aristotle and continuity, but about his reaction to the Zeno's paradoxes. So is this, I wonder how what I'm going to say relates to your interpretation. One could think Aristotle thought, no, Zeno did not show that motion is impossible, but he did show that we don't have a clear, coherent conceptual way.
Sorry, shows?
He did show that we do not have a clear and consistent way of conceptualizing it. Would you?
This is what Zeno said.
Is this what Aristotle, how Aristotle responded?
Oh, if I understand well, the point of the point of Aristotle about Zeno is the argument of Zeno is fallacious. Is a simple dialectical argument that I can destroy. Still, you put his finger on a very important things, and so it's not enough to say that the argument is fallacious. So question, and now that I say that the argument is wrong, I need to give a good way to shadow. So of course, the case of Achilles is possible. Zeno is wrong. The case of Achilles. Of course, Achilles reached the goal. There is nothing contradictory. Show you that there is nothing contradictory. So the argument of Zeno, hey, Zeno has no argument to convince me that Achilles does not move. Zeno does not argue to convince me that Achilles does not reach the goal. Once I get that, I must have nothing. Once I get that, now I have to be Guido, not finish. And Guido wants to describe what Achilles done, but describe. This is the problem that I do. This is my interpretation. So the reason for which Aristotle mentioned 4 times Zeno's paradoxes, 5 times, because you mentioned 4 times the paradoxes to describe them, and 1 time to say that are wrong. So when you say that are wrong, you see, say Zeno arguments are wrong because blah, 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 and other 4 times describing. If a real Aristotle was convinced that there are stupid arguments, he would not have mentioned that. So it seems that Aristotle is convinced of 2 things. One, that stupid argument. in the sense that as such they do not work, but still they put a finger on a very important thing. We do not know how to describe the race. Now that I show that the argument is not good, I need to make the real job to describe the race. This is what the way which I understand the point. James, you want to add something?
I did do, I look like I.
Well, I want to pick up on what you just said. Yeah. So, in these two places about infinite divisibility, is Aristotle using the same word, or what word does he use? What we translate as infinitely divisible? How is that said in Greek?
Diaretos as hyperon, divisible as infinite.
As unending?
As aperos,
Yeah.
eis aperos, aperon, sorry, eis aperon. We can translate usually at infinitum. In reality, we should translate more literally with no limit. With no limit. Aperon, with no limit. So it is divisible without no limit, literally speaking.
So I think James was bringing up an idea that might be interesting, which is that might mean divisible arbitrarily, including in place. So if you can divide it, if you can divide the line anywhere. Not
Can divide the
something like,
line?
I can divide the segment anywhere, rather than I can divide it and then again, without a limit. But it might also mean arbitrarily.
Yes.
And
That-
and that would be a stronger condition of infinitely divisible. Arbitrarily divisible
yeah.
is different than infinite.
There's absolutely no intermediate relations.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
there's nothing else that can.
This is a good point.
Yeah. this is
So
what James-
let
this is what
me-
James said.
let me better understand, because
Take out the point, then you can divide it to anywhere you want. But it's not continuous. If the element of the midpoint, you can divide it wherever you want.
no, attention. I'm not sure to grasp what Drew said, but I have the feeling that it could be more. So let's see whether I grasp the point. You say one thing is to say I have a rule from dividing, an algorithm, for example, divided in 2 or divided in 3.
Some rational.
No, not necessarily. For example, Aristotle, Achilles, and the tortoise, if they have a uniform motion, of course, the division is rational. But if the motion is not uniform, we cannot accept, support that is rational. So one thing is to say we have a machine to make the division. And when we have the machine to make the division, we cannot stop. So the machine continues to act. And it is the infinite infinite. Another thing is to say we can divide in absence of any machine. In any algorithm, I can divide path. I can solve, there is a sort of action of choice. A choice and choice. So there is no intrinsic difference between one point and another, simply because there is no point. And this would explain the relation between one definition and the other, because the other definition would say exactly what makes that there is no.
And this,
Possibly.
I think that could be explored, because it could explain.
Possibly, this could be interesting to explore. And in fact, when Aristotle said that the Achilles is the same paradox as dichotomy, said it is essentially the same paradox with only different, the division is not in 2. I say, okay, the fact the division is in 2, what we could interpret as the fact the division follows disparity into algorithm is not essential. That's not the point. The point is not that I have one way of dividing. The point is that I have an infinite division. So that could be relevant. Yes.
You were, well, yeah, this is a follow-up to this actually, because, I'm still not clear.
Sorry, in the work that I did on the divided in analytic philosophy, they add this custom that we should adopt here. This is an intervention, this is a volume. So this is very useful.
What does this mean?
So this means I accept now, because it's not the same part. This is I want to speak. So go.
Yeah, so about the definition, book 5, so because I feel like you have maybe two different sort of understanding of the definition that maybe, yeah, I think they're different from one another, that maybe sometimes you lean towards one and sometimes towards the other. So one understanding of this definition is that in the continuum you have what you call no singularity. So
No singularity.
no point that you can clearly identify as different from the others. It's sort of like homogeneity of the entire structure.
Homogeneity, yes.
And then, so I can see the link between that notion of homogeneity and then infinite divisibility. We sort of always do it, but it's arbitrary divisibility. But the other notion that seems to me to appear when you look at the definition is what I think it's usually called viscosity.
Sorry?
Viscosity of the continuum, which is the claim that if you take a continuum, you cannot separate it into two parts that do not overlap, two distinct parts that are not exhaustive. Right? So when you give your example of the diagonal, right? You said it's not a continuum because if you remove the point, right? You do remove the point. This is still infinitely divisible, right? But this is not a continuum. And it seems to me that the reason why it's not a continuum is because of this lack of viscosity. Because there's 2 parts. And so, I mean, I feel that there's like a sense in which you can understand this definition in book 5 as being about viscosity, because basically, the point, essentially the idea is that if you split the continuum into 2 parts, you have to choose where the point would go. And we can split if it goes in part 1 or part 2, and then you don't get two distinct parts, right? But that's different from homogeneity.
Yes. So in the only one chapter that we wrote about the book that is still, I don't know whether it will appear, one of the things that we say is essentially it is in another way. We do not use the word viscosity, but use the word connexity. And we say what clearly Aristotle seemed to understand is the continuity is not only a question of cardinality, is also a question of connexity. The way in which the parts are connected, not only how many parts there are, infinite, but the fact that they are connected one another. And so you're using the viscosity is another way to possibly a more clear way. We have to discuss a more clear, we can add it this way, but on the present point, I totally agree with you. You see, to say it in a way that then you will tell me whether I understood your point. But to say in a way that you would be happy to, if this thing that Aristotle has said to us, the continuity is not simply a metric question, it's also a topological. That thing that Aristotle said, and in some sense, the infinite definition grasps the metric aspect, and the division 5 grasps the topological aspect.
Right, definitely. So I definitely agree with that. Well, I mean, because homogeneity is also kind of like a different also notion, right? So I guess the point is that if you understand this definition of book 5 topologically as this sort of viscosity thing.
But it is about the point about.
But then the connection to homogeneity is not immediately clear to me anymore. Right?
The point about homogeneity is not only implicit in Aristotle. Of course, I could not go over to that. Aristotle makes the point clearly, because I came back to the trees to make it clear. This is a point that I would not have time to discuss in the talk here. When we speak of consecutive, and you see consecutive, the arrow go here, I go here. So the definition of consecutive is part of the definition of continuity. Aristotle takes consecutive as there is no eternity of the same thought. So this notion of the same thought, that is the idea of homogeneity, is made absolutely clear from Aristotle. A contiguous is to be consecutive, and a continuous to be contiguous. So it's to be homogeneous. Otherwise, there is no continuity. But this, of course, is not a sufficient condition, but is a necessary condition. Aristotle is explicit on it.
It seems to me that the dissolution of the paradoxes come about because there is an isomorphism between time and the
Space,
Space.
time and space, yes.
Okay, but as you pointed out, Aristotle wouldn't consider the broken line to be continuous but contiguous, and then it is not isomorphic to time. So what would he say about a runner that is running on a broken
No.
line?
No, this is not true. This is a good point, but it's a point on which I reflected. This is not true.
And
There is a difference.
following up, then what would he say about a runner that is running on a Weierstrass curve?
Okay, one source, one is the isomorphism of space of time goes together with an essential difference. And the essential difference is that the act of broken the continuity in space is a possible act. Material can break the continuity in space in this way. This is so, or I can broken the continuity of this on this one. This broken. I cannot broken the continuity of time materially. I can solo make it ideal. So I can imagine ideally a temporal correlate of this point, and this is the notion of now that Aristotle discussed, and longly, and he say exactly that the now is the correspective of point, but he say that whenever the point can be marked, the now can be only imagined, and the now does not exist because it's neither the past, it's still not the past, it's still not the future. No, it's not no more the past, and still not the future. So Aristotle teaches us perfectly clear the point that there is a difference between the time and the motion, but not really. Not really. Why? Because for Aristotle, any motion is in some sense. Okay, I am a little bit too categorical, but I think, let's say, Giovanna, if she were here, she would cry. You say you are assigned to Aristotle, but something that Aristotle never said. But I think that Aristotle implicitly say, or at least I understand Aristotle saying that any motion is a particular manifestation of the only one motion, that is the eternal and continual motion on the first sky. And the eternal and continual motion on the first sky is perfectly isomorphic to time, also on this respect. It cannot stop. So it can only ideally be stopped, but it cannot be materially stopped. So if we can stop the motion, or we can stop the segment, or we can broken the continuity, it's only because we are doing it with contingency. But we go from the contingent to the necessary, then the similarity, the isomorphism between time, space, and motion is perfect. This is.
If you're pulling this gun,
Sorry?
If you're pulling the gun of the sphere of the stars, then what can I say?
This is Aristotle. Then but we are finished it here. Sorry, we are finished it here. And you finished it. But what is the idea of Big Bang? There is a beginning. Okay, Aristotle was not
The broken line is contiguous.
motion after motion of the air. But once the Big Bang appeared, also what you say is the way that the world is continuous evolution that we cannot stop. So we can either stop, but we cannot stop in reality. And so arises is not only ideal, it's also fact. Is the evolution of the universe. Is a manifestation of the evolution of the universe, the manifestation of the eternal motion by Aristotle. I have to add, Jose, to make complete the answer, that Aristotle is also explicit on one point, that time does not exist for Aristotle.
Okay.
Time does not exist without man, without a soul. Time is simply the measure of motion according to the beforehand. So time exists because we measure motion. Time is dependent of the cognitive activity of the human being that measure motion. What exists is the eternal motion, not the time. And the eternal motion is not a motion that is there in any time. Aristotle is clear about it, because otherwise we would have time before the motion. So the eternity of motion is not the fact that in any time there is motion. The eternity of motion, it is necessity and is continuity, the fact that you never stop. So I don't know whether it's clear. So that to say the first motion is eternal because it takes place in all the time, means to accept the idea there is time before motion, logically speaking.
Okay.
And Aristotle does not want to do that. So the time is the measure of the first motion. I introduce time to measure the first motion. So it's very Kantian, Aristotle, in some sense. Okay, the time is the way in which I speak about the first motion. And what makes the first motion eternal? Not the fact that it does not stop with time, the fact that it is necessary. The necessity is the mark of eternity, not the presence in the eternity of time.
Yeah.
These are it, okay?
I don't think I can understand right away what you're saying because you're using words with different meaning that what I understand when I think about motion, I think about displacement of some object in time. So
It's exactly what Aristotle would deny.
yeah, exactly. So I
Emotion is a primitive fact.
Yes, I cannot understand what
No,
you're
no,
saying
but
right away.
you are perfectly free to not understand it. I also perfectly free to say, no, it's not a joke. It's a joke, of course, because always, but it's not only a joke. When I say you are perfectly free to not understand what I mean more deeply, you are perfectly free to think that the category that Aristotle used to describe reality are not a good one. That is totally another story. And in fact, scientific revolution has
Yeah, I don't want to put
maybe
any value on that.
so I am not defending that. But what I am defending is the idea that Aristotle has about continuity goes much farther than the limit of his physics. That is what I want to defend. And that the revolution, the scientific revolution that in some sense destroyed physics, Aristotle's notion, still conserved a lot of aspects of Aristotle's notion. Aristotle has a lot of aspects of Aristotle conceptualization, and continuity, according to me, is one of them. The very moment in which the idea of continuity by Aristotle is broken is in 19th century. Before I don't know an account of continuity different than Aristotle. Continuity is a fact, is given, is there. There is no question to define the continuum. Continuity, what there is. This is the continuum, what there is. So the motion is what there is. The motion what there is. And the time is me. When I look at what there is, then I introduce time as a measure of the motion. The motion is there, independent of me. The time, no. The time is me. Without me, no time. This is the way in which I explicit. It's exactly the way. There is no time without. So.
Suke,
Sorry?
without suke,
Without Suke.
so.
Exactly. Exactly.
That line.
So mind. What you want, but in any case, this is the point. The time has not been independent of substance. Okay, other questions? I think that we can go to continuously eat. Thank you.